Serious nurses, hospital workers of Reddit. What is the most paranormal weirdest thing you have ever experienced while working? In the morgue at my hospital. I would always hear knocking coming from inside the freezer. It really creeped me out, especially when the pathologist looked up, grabbed me by the shoulders, stared me straight in the eye, and said, "You hear that? You never open that door when they're knocking." Never. It turned out to be some loose pipes. He thought it was hilarious I didn't sleep that night. I might be a bit late to the party. I'm an RN, and while I was a student I was caring for a lady who had end-stage renal failure, had a DNAR and was shutting down. We were having a little chat when she stopped, looked over my shoulder and said, "Bill's here, love. I've got to go," and swiftly stopped breathing. Read her old notes, and Bill was her deceased husband. About 2 years ago we treated patients during a fungal meningitis outbreak. Our acute care floor has a census of 20. During this, at least 10 to 15 were meningitis patients, age ranging from 20s to 90s. There are no shared rooms and all the patients were in isolation. No contact with one another. Many of them had the same hallucinations. Children in the corners of their rooms and auditory hallucinations of religious music. I did my clinical as a CNA in a memory care unit. I helped feed this woman. She never really moved. Never talked. It was like she was in a coma or something. I would wheel her into the dining room. I can hardly get any real food in her. I'm able to slide in some special ice cream. For days she doesn't move or have any response. I'm feeding her and talking to myself pretty much. After about 10 minutes she slowly turns her head and says, "Oh hello," then she rotates her head back, her blank staring position. Super creepy. When I was a student, I got called in on a stroke patient. She had coded and they were doing CPR. They worked for 45 minutes, but she died. They cleaned her up and called on the family to say goodbye. By the time the family left, she had been both brain dead and without a pulse for more than 45 minutes. Blood had filled her brain, and she was completely gray and started to smell. Suddenly, she sat up and called for her family. The nurses rushed to get monitors and equipment back on her. Started working on her again. She stabilized, said goodbye to her family, and promptly died a second time. Night nurse for 4 years now at an old folks home. At a palliative who couldn't sleep because of incredibly vivid hallucinations. She would describe voodoo people around her room that would just stare at her waiting for her to die. I didn't take it seriously until the lady across the hall, who rarely ever spoke, starting seeing them in her room too. Legitimate shivers. Used to work in a personal care home. A couple of times, a day or so after a resident had passed, their call bell would go off in their room. No one was in the room when the call bell went off on any of the occasions. We had one resident die pretty traumatically. Nurses had to perform CPR because he was a full code. At night, the midnight staff said they saw him at the end of the hall just walking down like he always did. Then, the alarm on the door to the outside, it was a secured unit for Alzheimer's dementia, went off. It was the door he always tried when he was looking to get out. I work in a cardiovascular surgical ICU. We have a lot of fucked up people, both physically and mentally, that come through our unit. We had a stretch of nights where each corner room of our unit, it is a perfect square, reported seeing a cat walking around. Not a friendly cat either. Apparently, the thing was hissing at them. The accounts were so similar to each other we actually spent probably a half hour looking around for a cat and then had security plan ops come look as well. No cat was ever seen or found. 2 of those 4 patients coded the next day. Therapist in an acute long-term care facility. We have 4 main hallways. A lot of the action is on 302B. Residents will hear this little boy laugh. Some see him. Some just hear. They play with him and let him sit on their laps. It's very strange to see how comfortable a 98-year-old woman feels when talking to a little boy ghost. Grandma instincts kick in, I guess. I work a stroke telemetry floor on the bot shift. Most of our patients are elderly. Apparently, there are 2 things that patients see before they pass away. Some will say that 2 men are walking in their rooms and telling them to get ready to leave. The patient will call and tell us that these men are big and abrasive in their demeanor. They are either terrified or annoyed when they see the 2 men. The other thing they will see is a little boy who will go into their rooms and try to wake them up. The boy is usually loud and runs around their rooms. The patients will call and ask who's letting children just run around late night. Several nights or even that same shift we're coding or cleaning the patient for the funeral home to pick up. My town has 2 really old hospitals. One no longer functions as overnight. And the stories are unsettling. No one cleans the older alone. Because all the lights and call bells go off. On other floors there's a kid with his ball, a lady in a white dress, etc. The coworker was cleaning an entire floor utterly solo, the norm, and bounced between rooms because the cleaning solution stays wet for a few min. Upon returning to a freshly wiped bed, Handprints were clearly visible. Edit. Yes. Hotel U and KGH. So many creepy stories in the city. Patient had passed away during my shift. The patient was well known and liked on the ward. At handover that evening, I mentioned the patient had passed away. The door to the handover room, which I had closed, opened and shut just as I mentioned she had passed away. She was totally saying goodbye. Later that month on nights we were chatting about said patient at the nurse's station. Weirdly, a card which was pinned on a notice board fell just as we started talking about her. Went to pick it up. It was a card from the patient's family saying thanks for caring their parent. I thought it was quite nice. It's not my personal story. But when my mom worked as an ER nurse, a guy came in from a car accident and was losing blood. In the midst of resuscitation, the man jolts awake and screams, "Don't let me go back there. Please. Please. Please don't let me go back." A few seconds later they lost him. Memory care unit. I'm a CNA. We have a room that's a solo bed at the end of the hall with a woman who cannot move her body. She's pretty far gone memory-wise. So when her call light goes off, it's terrifying to go reset it. She can't push it. We blame the cat a lot, but several times it was locked in another room. I work midnights in a long-term care facility as a nurse's assistant. I have 2 men under my care and both of them are unable to use their call lights. They have severe dementia and debilitating Parkinson's disease, but still their lights are looped around their bed rail. One night their light came on and I went to answer it already confused and creeped out. I turned it off and left the room. Before I could get 2 doors up the light came back on. I went in there and both lights were unplugged from the wall and thrown under their beds. I fished them out, plugged them back in and left. I've seen shadows standing over the dying and felt a tap on my shoulder while doing chest compressions, so I knew that lady had passed. I'm not a believer, but some of those things can't be explained. This might get buried and is not really nurse related other than the fact my grandmother's nurses told me. My great-grandmother was 94 and just started suffering with dementia. She told the home nurses and I that there was a little boy in the corner of the living room who would taunt and tease my great-grandmother while laughing at her, telling her she was going to die. Well, at first it was a little disturbing and we all shrugged it off because of her dementia. But then shit got real when my best friend came over with his little boy who is about 3 or 4. The little guy pointed over to the same corner and yelled, "I'm going to beat you up." When we asked him what that was about, he told us that he saw another little boy in the corner and he is not nice. We flipped the fuck out. I got shivers just typing this. Maybe Nana wasn't hallucinating. I work as an EMT. And the one that I have that best fits the question is an elderly male who had fallen and hit his head a few hours before they called for an ambulance. The guy was fucked. All of the signs of a traumatic brain injury. All of his responses to our questions to this point were nonsensical. We were about 4 minutes from the hospital when we tried talking to him again. And he seemed to come as clear as day and open his eyes and stare at us to say, "I'm dead." My partner tries to say, "Oh, don't say that," and he stares more intensely at us to reiterate and say, "No, I mean it. I'm dead." He died an hour later. Nurse here. I work night shift when a ward patient's relative came running to the nurse's station in a panic. "Nurse. Come quick." She cried. "What happened? You have to see it for yourself." I ran to the ward when this little old lady patient was crying and holding on to the bed for dear life. Her bed was shaking. Now, you're probably thinking that the lady was the one causing all that shaking. But she was this frail, practically emaciated thing. She couldn't have barely rattled the bed rails. The ward had only 2 other patients in it and their respective watchers. Everyone was huddled in a corner, shaking in fright. Apparently that particularly ward was seldom used. And the bed that old lady lay in was rarely occupied. People who have laid in it complained of nightmares where they hear screams and laughter of angry children. I guess some restless spirit called dibs on that particular bed. Worked at a hospital, doing transport for a couple of years. The transport home base was in the basement of the hospital, where all the laundry is done and supplies are also sorted there. I hated working late nights after this incident. On this particular night, I was the only one in the basement when I heard whistling at the end of the hallway by the elevator. I poked my head around the corner expecting to see my only coworker on duty that night, but there was absolutely no one there. I shrugged it off. I'm not easily spooked. Nights are slow, so I ate some snacks and hung out in the break room for a bit. Next thing I know, I hear a loud bang. I walked into the hallway and a bed is rolling down the hall, bumping into the sides. At this point I think that my coworker is bullshitting me. I radio him and he says he's upstairs in the cafeteria. I still don't believe him and think I'll catch him in the act. I walk past the laundry room and the machines start. Hop my head in there expecting to find him, but it's completely empty. Okay. Starting to get a little nervous. I walk into the laundry room. And the machines completely stop. I freeze, then run out and head towards the elevator when I hear whistling again. At this point, I know I am the only worker in the basement. As I am standing there waiting for the elevator, things start falling off of the shelves down the hall. Boxes of gloves, tissues, packages of tubes. I am literally standing there watching them fall off one by one at the opposite end of the hallway. I shit you not, my entire body broke out in goosebumps. My hair stood on end, and I had this strong gut feeling I was being watched. I was not alone. As I'm getting into the elevator, I feel what feels like someone brushing my arm. Went upstairs and found my coworker in the cafeteria. Freaked out to him. I got the fuck out of there and transferred soon after that. The creepy thing to add to it is that I usually whistle mindlessly to myself at work. It was almost as if the spirit was mimicking me. Creepiest feeling ever. Edit. Transferred to the operating room soon after that. I was part of an emergency C-section where a baby was lost. My coworkers and I occasionally heard a baby's cries in the hallways at night. The security workers have also witnessed crazy things, but my post is getting long now. First story patient had been in CCU, where I work at the time, for a long period of time, 6 months. We had finally been transferred to med-surg floor and he coded. We worked on him for 45 min to an hour, and he had no pulse or heart rhythm the entire time, and the docs had decided to call it, and his family walk in the room, leans over him and rubs his chest lightly, and says his name and immediately regains a pulse, and regains consciousness. Second story patient comes in coding, and we are working on him and we are getting nothing. So we bring in his wife to say goodbye, and she starts yelling at him at the top of her lungs, and he comes back, so we arrange transfer to a tertiary hospital, and he codes again, so she comes back and yells at him again and comes back again. Cut to they are loading him into the helicopter, and he codes again, so they bring him back into our after working on him for a bit on the helipad, and his wife yells at him again and once again he immediately comes back. Eventually they decide to have his wife ride in helicopter with him to make sure she can scare him back to life if he were to code again. The guy ended up living and received a heart transplant and is still alive to this day, all thanks to his wife scaring the life back into him. I work in maintenance in a hospital, but this story comes from out of work hours. Back in November my grandfather passed away. He had been living in a care home for several years now, and as we were from a smaller city, his main care aide was actually an ex's mother who I am still close to. Nearing his final days she texted me that things weren't looking good and to get my mom who works out of town and myself to see him ASAP. The next 2 nights were exhaustive. Her and I barely left his bedside. We were wetting his lips, rubbing his head and singing Charlie Pride and telling him stories from my childhood and from my mom's. At one point Is Anybody Going to San Anton comes on the CD player and mom tears up talking about how this song reminds her of her father most. He wasn't really coherent besides a glimmering moment the first day we had gotten there. And by the final day we were sitting, watching the breaths turn to choke breaths. As the hour got nearer, my ex's mom was contacted and came in on her day off to sit with us for that final hour. My mom had her father's head in her lap and we still had Charlie Pride on the radio. She was whispering in his ear to stop being stubborn, that she would take care of her brothers and that she had me to take care of her. The gaps got longer and longer in his breaths. My ex's mom was sitting next to me. The CD player playing behind us and my mom laying on the opposite side of the care home bed. All of a sudden his breathing stops and in that moment, so did the CD player. It hadn't skipped once the whole weekend. My mom, figuring Terrine had turned it off. Starting sobbing, assuming it was to signify he was officially gone. I just sat and looked at Terrine like, did that just happen? After a good 20 seconds. Out of nowhere he took a shuddery breath. And the CD scrambled forward. And the song just before Is Anybody Going to San Anton, not sure if that's the name of the song, but it was about not wanting to miss someone, started playing. And then he was gone by the end of San Anton, the song mom remembered him most by. Terrine mentioned odd things happen more often than not as a person finally passes. DL Drive, my grandfather's CD player decided to skip it a little too perfect of timing.